My name is Mary Lynn Valinga, and
You can look at me too if
oh,
that's easier.
yeah, I worked at the Bee for 27 years. I started in 1991, and I was a reporter. I was a business reporter, I was a Metro reporter, I was a Capitol Bureau reporter. I was the city editor, the business editor, and the Metro editor before I left in 2018. So I worked there for 27 years, and I'm originally from Chicago.
And I'm Joyce Terhar, and I started a little bit before Mary Lynn in 1988 as a business reporter. That's how I came in, and I worked there for 30 years. 20 of those years, I was either managing editor for 13 and the executive editor for 7 before I left.
And I'm Dale Kassler. I'm the new guy. I joined the paper in 1996. I'm originally from Hartford, Connecticut. I was a business writer at the Bee for most of my time there. And in recent years, I was covering the environment and water and drought and that sort of thing. And I left, it's November 2022, and I left 2 weeks ago. I retired.
And I'm Tony Bijak. I was a news reporter for the Bee for 31 years, from 1990 to 1 year ago, 2021, when I retired. And to get things going here, I was among this group of reporters and editors who migrated over from the old Sacramento Union in the 1980s and early 90s. And I think it was a pivotal moment in journalism in Sacramento, because the Union, which had predated the Bee, the Union was formed in 1851, the Bee in 1857. They had been rivals for the entire history of the city of Sacramento, but in the 80s, the Union began to falter. So some of us were eager to move over to the stronger newspaper, and the Union folded in 1994, which left the Bee as the only newspaper in town. And that was what I think the halcyon days of the Bee. But when the four of us arrived around that time, I think we didn't know. We were the generation that was going to have to deal with two of the most cataclysmic moments in the Sacramento Bee history and the national journalism history. One was the arrival of the digital era, the internet, which forced us at the Bee to really reinvent. Under Joyce, much of the time, we had to go from being a newspaper that landed on your porch once a day to a 24/7 digital news service. And that was dramatic and wrenching, liberating, but it was a life or death sort of thing. And at the same time, while that was a national issue that newspapers faced, at the same time, McClatchy faced this issue locally of some decisions that were made in around 2005 that caused us to go into a slow motion descent into bankruptcy. In 2020, the McClatchy family lost the Bee, and so we went from being a newspaper that was just locally owned, with roots in the community, to being owned by a Chatham...
A hedge fund.
A hedge fund in New Jersey. So in a minute, Joyce is going to lead us through how she led us through into the digital era, and how Dale will talk about the bankruptcy, because he's the expert on that. He covered it for the Bee. But back in 1990, when we first joined, Mary Lynn, the Bee was just riding high. It was a hive of activity over 21st and Keele. Yeah.
Yeah, in a way, it was a company town. It was kind of spoiled for any other place, really, because we had a fitness center in the basement that cost virtually nothing to belong to. We had subsidized childcare. Both of my kids went through subsidized childcare from the Bee. The Bee was the first paper I was ever at that had an electronic library. I don't know about you guys, but all the papers that I had worked at before, you had to go get the clips and the envelope, and the Bee had this fancy electronic library that went back to 1984. It was very exciting. And we had the lending library. If you needed a book, you could just go get one there. We had the doctor's office. If you had a minor ailment, you could just go upstairs. And the cafeteria that was practically went around the block or around the clock. And then, just the ambition for the people then were coming to the Bee from all over the country. I was living in Boston before we moved, but Gregory, who was the editor then, really did recruit people from all over the country. He didn't recruit me. I just happened to walk in the door, and but nonetheless, got some amazing opportunities. And,
Oh yeah, from a lot from Dallas, from Denver, from the East Coast, the Baltimore Sun. People came in waves. He'd hire one or two, and then they'd tell them about all of their friends, and a lot of talent came to the Bee under Gregory Fogg. That was sort of his mission at the time, was growing the paper. So we were there for the growth in the Bee, and the by the time I came, the company had become public. When you guys all were there, it was publicly held. It's a very different environment, and if you look at that era now, the Bee was independent. A very different situation from what it is now and from what most newspapers are now. Decisions were made in Sacramento about editorial positions, about story coverage, about all of that. It wasn't a group effort. It was journalism aimed at the Sacramento audience. And the Bee was part of the community in an important way. It gave away tons of money to charities around town. It launched the Book of Dreams project, which is a series of stories and fundraising every holiday season to benefit people in the community who need it. It just kind of built on this foundation that the McClatchys had created of funding the arts, and there's a park named after McClatchy and a school named after McClatchy. So your point about it being a company town, it was a force in the community. Editorial positions affected decisions. People were on kind of the same page to a certain extent, because when everybody reads the local paper, which is kind of what it used to be like, then you talk about the same things. And so you have this kind of community conversation that's ongoing. And the Bee would build on that by having town halls on different issues of import, locally. Just a whole variety of things like that. And so when we talk about the transition of the paper over time, part of it is journalism and news coverage and what can people get now in terms of local news and an understanding of the community. And part of it is this progression that has been a sad one, in my opinion, of the paper's institutional standing in the community, its influence, and its kind of role as a kind of to bring people together and to be the watchdog and all of that kind of thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But I think first Dale's going to tell us a little bit about how that all started.
Well, and just to add on to your point, when I joined the paper in '96, I was one of those people from around the country. I was at the Des Moines Register, and I just couldn't get over this place. We talked about the library and the cafeteria and all this stuff, but still, being a newspaper and all, within 5 minutes of you getting there, people are griping and complaining, because that's what we all did.
Journalists do.
That's what we did. And I remember shortly after I joined the paper, a group of us went over to Benny's, the bar across the street from the old Bee, and people were griping. He said, "Wait a minute! I just got here. Give me like a week before I get disillusioned." But no, it was an unbelievably prosperous organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember. This is maybe a small point to most of the people in your audience, but the Bee didn't have a publisher then.
Right.
The Bee had a general manager who was considered a co-equal with the editor. That's how much authority the editor had, is he didn't even really have to answer to the big shot publisher he was co-equal with the person making the business decisions for the paper. And I think you guys all traveled big time for the Bee.
Tony went to Haiti. I went to Mexico to cover the year anniversary of NAFTA. We went all over the state and all over the country. Yeah.
I sold you guys on a trip to Charlotte, North Carolina, of all places, in the late '90s, because Bank of America and Wells Fargo had been sold to banks headquartered in Charlotte. I'm not really sure if our readers care all that much, but by God, I sold you on a trip to Charlotte, and I went.
Dale, I wasn't even going to mention this, it's so embarrassing, but when I was a new reporter here, they sent me to Hawaii to cover a conference. Just like, I don't know how necessary that was, but it does show that the paper had money. We sent somebody to Israel to cover a war, we sent somebody to Somalia when the drought was killing people. You know, we were kind of, we had a bureau in Mexico City, and in San Francisco, and in LA, and so the mission of the paper at that time was very broad. Yes, we covered local and California. You know, we did have the Capitol Bureau. We had somebody in DC, but we also, I think, were aspirational in terms of telling people, telling our readers about things going on in the world that we thought they might be interested in, and it. That mission probably lasted most of Gregory's time as editor, I would say, because he really was there during the wealthiest part, I think, of the company.
I remember at my job interview asking him, "Who's your competition?" And I figured he'd say San Jose Mercury News, San Francisco Chronicle, LA Times. He didn't bat an eye. He wasn't being facetious.
Oh, that's interesting.
I was like, "Oh, really?"
No,
all right.
Well, certainly from a political and statewide reporting out of the bureaus, the B and the LA Times always had the biggest bureaus, and very much considered each other competitive. And we covered topics that were statewide, as you, of all people, know, because you were doing water and drought and things like that. But yeah, the staffs were a little bit different in size.
Yeah, they were, because I remember one time I was in the Capitol Bureau and I was covering a Senate race, a U.S. Senate race, and a reporter there at the LA Times broke a story that it really bothered me that I didn't break. And then, you know, thought about like all the people they had in that race actually, because it wasn't just people in the Capitol Bureau, it was people in LA too. Right. And it was the person who broke that story is at the New York Times. I still kind of snarl when I see his byline.
This is an example to me of what I felt was mission creep a little bit in the era when we were so well off. We had this ambition that we're going to be out there with the big boys. That's why I found myself in Haiti one day. Why? Because I think Kent Pollock said, we have the money.
Right.
Everybody's looking. This was a moment when the dictator was being ousted, and the United States was bringing the duly elected president back in, and all the big newspapers were there. So we wanted to be there. We had the B was at that point so situated so well, I think, that we could look way beyond our borders. Clearly, we are in a California newspaper, not a Sacramento newspaper, but at that point, going to Somalia, we went to South Africa. I felt like what I mean by mission creep is that, as you said, covering things that not necessarily were of great interest to the local people. At the time that I went to Haiti, I was doing some stories about some suburban fire chiefs here who were spiking their pensions, and I was just on that over the course of months. So I had to take a time out from that to go tell everybody what's going on in Port-au-Prince, you know, and loved it. I mean, it was just, you know, these moments, you know, these are some of these things about journalism that are a thrill, or such as, you know, getting to see the world. But I think that what we're going to discover is that as we get into this digital era, we realize that our strength really is California and Sacramento, and that we have to relearn what our brand, or not our brand, but what's going to keep us viable.
It is the brand to a certain extent, and it really started when Rick Rodriguez became editor, because he very much emphasized the beat structure in the newsroom, and kind of the tone of what we were going to do changed a little bit. We became, I think, just much more focused on what in the industry we always call the kind of bread and butter beats, covering City Hall, covering the Capitol, doing all the local stuff. Plus, McClatchy had created this structure earlier where we had a neighbors division, which, and then we had the main B newsroom, and neighbors was all over the region, and they had offices everywhere. And it was not the most efficient because a B reporter and a neighbors reporter would find themselves at the same meeting doing their own stories, which then went out to readers twice. And I don't know how much confusion that caused, but it was reality. So we were able to, during that era, negotiate to bring neighbors into the main B newsroom. And that's the biggest the newsroom has ever been. I think around that time, we were roughly around 300 journalists, including maybe a little bit more than 300, including, I know, very different from today's world, including the editorial board. And it meant that we had offices in Folsom and Elk Grove and Roseville. Because of traffic, you can't get to news that fast sometimes. And we got very hyper local for a while in the 2000s. To your point about kind of, I actually think that came a little bit before the just giant push on digital, but it was certainly part of the evolution that we've seen in the time that all of us have been connected to the paper in terms of how we went about trying to serve the region and readers.
Well, mentioning digital,
Can I just say one more thing about the Beat Arrow first?
you can.
Thank you. That I really appreciated actually when that focus changed, because we used to do the Bee used to do a lot of projects that didn't, because of that sort of mission creep, because of that broad scope. The danger in that sometimes is that you do things that don't have a lot of focus or a ton of specificity as regards your local area, or a big raison d'etre, as it were. And I would also say that for all three of us, our stars skyrocketed when the beats became more important, because we're all three of us beat reporters, like really good beat reporters. Dale also is the fastest person in the world, but but all really good beat reporters, and so it wasn't any longer like you had to find your life's fulfillment spending 6 months on a project that was going to make you want to throw yourself off a bridge because it didn't seem like it was going to end. Like, it could be a thing where you just like to pound out one good front page story after another and really work a topic. And so in a way that was...
And I do think that there is value in both.
Yeah, sure, there is. I'm just saying that for me,
Right,
that was,
and that the paper continued to do special kinds of coverage for readers. Over the years, there have just been so many giant investigations and projects like, that won the paper Pulitzer prizes, the Monkey Wars and the Sierra coverage that Tom Knudsen did, and the Hetch Hetchy editorials that Tom Filt did, and then Renee's photography, Renee Byer, wow, just stunning work. But yes, we got more local. And during that time, the whole company was changing. And I think, Dale, you were covering that for the Bee, which is not the easiest thing to do when you're a reporter, and you're a reporter in the newsroom that has corporate right down the hall from you. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that change.
But it did make it convenient.
Sure, it did make it convenient.
That day in the spring of 2006, when Gary Pruitt, the chief executive, came skipping down that ramp. Remember, the business news department
I do remember that ramp.
Business news department was in a section of the newsroom that was at the bottom of a ramp. And Gary Pruitt came, I swear to God he was skipping. I don't think I'm exaggerating here, but who knows. To say, hey, Dale, Knight Ritter's for sale. The Knight Ritter chain, which was under financial pressure because the industry was changing, because revenues were slowing because of the internet. Newspapers weren't doing quite as well as they had been. And Knight Ritter's shareholders, the major shareholders, basically went to management with an edict and said, we don't really see a way out of this. It's time to put the company up for sale. And that was that. And that set in motion the
Right.
sort of the single biggest business decision maybe in McClatchy's history, In the summer of 2006, McClatchy bought Knight Ridder.
And it bought it on the heels of this, 5-6 year expansion where it had been buying papers in South Carolina. It bought, the Raleigh News and Observer and
Right.
what was called Nando, which was one of the early aggressive
Right.
efforts by newspaper companies to go into digital news. And McClatchy wanted that technology. It bought the Star Tribune in Minneapolis.
Star Tribune in Minneapolis, still the single largest newspaper purchase in American history.
Sound right?
Yes,
It was
Wow.
1.2
1.2 billion for the Minneapolis Star Tribune.
And then what did it sell the Star
Well, you're
Tribune
getting ahead
for?
of the story, but yes, they ended up
okay.
selling it for
You-
half as much. Okay.
How much did
Yeah.
Patrick, what's his face, pay for the LA Times?
Way like a $500 million or
Like
something.
$500 million for
Yes.
the LA
Well,
Times.
the
No, I know that. I'm just
Sure,
it's a
but-
lesser
In a different era.
In a
But the
different
point
era.
is,
yeah.
they sort of, the McClatchy felt it needed to get bigger, a lot bigger,
Yeah.
because they saw the internet coming. They were not oblivious to it. They felt like they needed a bigger base of operations to do the investments that they would need in order to become more of a digitally focused operation. But at the same time, by purchasing a company that was bigger than McClatchy, I think about twice the size, they wound up with about $3 billion of debt at a point when the industry was clearly slowing down.
Yeah.
Now, timing is everything in this world. Literally, the first quarter after the deal wrapped up, revenue just started to fall off a cliff. Like what had been a slowdown was no longer a slowdown. It was now a slide. And it just slid and slid and slid. And quarter after quarter, the revenues were falling 10, 15, 20%. And there just seemed to be no bottom to it.
Well, it has, that slide has continued.
Oh,
Has it continued every quarter, not necessarily every quarter, but we're in 2022 right now.
We don't really know the last 2 years.
'cause
We
it was
can
private.
presume because
Sure.
it's now a private
Sure.
company and the
But-
numbers are not publicly reported.
But you can also look at the industry and what's happening elsewhere,
Right.
and I think you would be safe in assuming that they're not growing.
so I
Right.
Yes,
believe, I
think that's
remember,
a safe assumption,
Yeah.
yes.
I believe I remember, you can confirm this, but I believe that right around then, 2006 or 2007, was our high point in terms of employment in the newsroom, right? When we brought in neighbors and everything. And I
That
believe,
was a little bit before that, but still. Yeah.
right in there.
Yeah.
And I very much remember a meeting in the newsroom in which Rick was talking about potentially blowing out the back wall by features to expand the newsroom, right?
We spent money to have that design.
And what year was that?
I do not remember.
Embarrassingly near the slide, right?
So I would guess in that kind of, 2003 to 2007, somewhere in there. Because we brought neighbors in the early 2000s, and we were expanding staff at that time, and we did start needing more room, and that was a multi-year project, so somewhere around there.
Yeah.
What I don't know how aware in the general public is, and this is just something to really understand about this, is that when Craigslist started in 1995-ish, and probably most of the country didn't know anything about it yet, and it was ironically the same year SacB.com started. But Craigslist took a while to gain momentum, and what it did was basically take away classified advertising as a huge driver of newspaper revenue. And so the industry, even before online, had already changed so radically with, in Sacramento, it was the union going out of business. But across the country, 2 and 3 newspaper towns, most of them ended up being 1 newspaper towns. And the result was that the one left standing was a monopoly that made a lot of money. And then
And classifieds were incredibly profitable
it was about a third of our
because
revenue,
you
I think.
didn't have commissioned salespeople running around
Right.
town selling the ads. People brought them into you. They walked
Yeah,
them
or
in
called.
the door.
I mean, there
But the
were
point-
there
but
was some staff,
The
but
point
yes,
is, the
yes.
selling costs were minimal
Right.
compared to display advertising.
And in Sacramento, it was more important than a lot of markets because for some reason we're car country and car advertising in Sacramento was a lot of money.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
Oh,
it just
okay.
drove classified.
Mhm.
And so it was, you look at this kind of just list of things papers made money on. They made a ton of money on classified. And that started dropping off in the early 2000s, before the Knight Ridder sale. And publishers were starting to talk about how they were starting to see that kind of drop off. But it didn't truly hit the,
Fan.
the books, whatever you want to say, until after the
Right.
Knight Ridder deal had closed. And the purchases, someone told a group of Sacramento bee managers around that time that McClatchy's expansion was largely made on the shoulders of how well Sacramento was doing. I mean, there were a lot of papers. It was getting, obviously, revenues increased a ton when it bought Minneapolis, when it bought Raleigh, all of that. But Sacramento was performing extraordinarily well. And then, bit by bit, I mean, that was the era when readers their subscriptions were subsidized by advertising. Nobody paid that much for a Sacramento Bee or any newspaper subscription. And then you start losing the classifieds, and then on the heels of that, retail ads, and then the model had to
And
change.
circulation was falling as well. I mean,
Well, yeah, prices were going up.
for
Prices
whatever-
were going up, and there's a lot of news free online. There just is. And we
Yeah.
live in a country where a few years ago, the stat I read was something like 13 or 14% of, and I think it's higher now, of US citizens pay for news. Very different from other countries. So you have an environment where people expect to get news for free because you can watch TV for free or listen to public radio for free, or nowadays go to so many different online sites, some of which are extremely legit, and get free news. So yeah.
Yeah, so it was a tough time.
There was a moment. Well, we came into the occupation as the mentality of being reporters as writers, and thumbsuckers, and you have one deadline at the end of the day.
Do you want to explain that jargon?
Oh, that was Maury Mock did that to me. Maury Mock did that to me.
And TikToks.
In the beat newsroom in the '90s, you could say, I don't do dailies.
No, I
do thumbsuckers. I'll turn in the story on Friday, and you'll run it on Sunday. So
Wow, I never said that.
yeah. So what was my point? My point was that there was this dramatic change that journalists in newsrooms had to go through somewhere during this period where you had one deadline. It was like if you got your story done at 5:30 or 6:30 or 7, that was it.
I can speak to this from both standpoints. I watched your byline count go through the roof
When
because I knew what everybody's were. I can speak directly to this in terms of the productivity of individuals, right? And what happened over time as the demand.
But it
increased.
took time. I mean, I have this very distinct memory of Rick Rodriguez, and probably you standing by his side, some point in the early 2000s, standing up at a staff meeting at that auditorium across the street from the old building, saying, we are going to start to break news online. We're no longer, up to that point, the great vaunted Bee digital operation consisted of once a day posting that day's stories
Yes.
from the newspaper.
Which has happened automatically.
Right.
It's just part of the production
Right,
cycle.
right.
Yeah.
And anyway,
Yeah.
Rick said, well, okay, so if a big story breaks at 11 in the morning, we're going to run out and do a story. And a lot of us were, are you kidding?
Right.
it's near lunchtime.
No. It wasn't so much out of laziness.
No, it's we're
It was-
scooping ourselves.
We were scooping. We were
scooping
undermining
ourselves.
the newspaper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why would people bother to buy the newspaper the next day if they already got the
Right.
news for free online the day before?
Because there was no paywall there. which is
I
an
know,
important
but-
thing
but
to remind people
Yes,
of.
right.
It was free
It was,
online.
it was absolutely free, but I think the reporters went, is this guy out of his mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, but what we didn't see at that point was that people would say, why do I buy the paper? Why do I read tomorrow
When I can read what's
when I can
free
find out
online
today what's going on today?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I,
And so-
I get it, yeah.
I
Yeah, and we
remember all
eventually
these-
got it.
We had all these meetings later on where we would try to like thread the needle on that, where I can remember all these meetings about what we would hold back and what we would put online. Like breaking news, you had to put online, but your bigger enterprise, like you would hold it, like you would put it in the paper first and break it online a day later. And that way people would be penalized for not
Right.
paying for the paper or whatever. It was just all trying
Right.
to figure out that equation and what would
It was
actually
all still
work.
about propping up the newspaper,
Yeah.
the printed paper, and it took a while. I remember when Tower Records went out of business, when the they had filed for bankruptcy and the liquidating firm had won the auction in court, so the company was going to be liquidated. Tower Records, big deal. It was a Friday afternoon, so I just sat down and wrote my story for Saturday morning's paper. And this was in 2006.
Yeah,
This
we
was
were
several
so late
years
to the
after
party.
Rick's speech
Yeah.
Sure.
to the newsroom.
Sure, but no iPhone yet, right?
Okay.
No iPad yet.
the
I'm just talking about how things change.
Yes, I know,
in
but the
terms
point
of
is,
readership.
it took the newsroom a while to get on board with this whole thing.
Decades.
We were a little late.
Well,
We
yeah.
were a little late to the party. Let's be honest. I mean, we did not get the internet at our desks until like 2001 or 2. Right. I mean, I think that the first time I saw the World Wide Web graphic interface was at an investigative reporters and editors conference in like 1995.
Well, explain what our computers were at the time.
Our computers were these dumb mini terminals, and they were
Word processors.
Yeah, they were essentially word
Yeah.
processors, and we shared them also. So they swiveled, so like one person could use it or the other person could use it, and yeah, they were pretty antiquated by the time. I mentioned to somebody that I knew recently that worked at the LA Times when we got them. They were shocked, like they had
When did they have them? I'm just curious.
in that, before 2000 certainly.
And as late as that was, there were people in the room who had a fit that they had to work on a PC because they were completely intimidated by it. So you talk about transitioning a workforce or a newspaper or reader habits or whatever, or our personal habits. I mean, just look at how what we do every day has changed just markedly in the last couple of decades. And then you try to like plot the points along the line where things happen that really made a big difference. So yeah, for the Bee, you had to get internet access to every single person in the room to really get people thinking about digital and how to use it and all of that. But when you look at reader habits, they started evolving a lot with the iPhone and then with an iPad. I remember when iPads came out, they were kind of viewed initially as, well, that's how everybody's going to be reading news at some point. And then once everybody started having iPhones and then Androids, news alerts and getting news online right away meant a lot more at that point because people were taking their phones everywhere and they wanted to know everything right away. So that happened. When did iPhone come out? 2009, 2007, somewhere in there. I might have written that down on one of these things, but the iPad was a couple years behind that, and then it's sort of chicken and egg in a lot of ways. It's kind of like the way people read newspapers is changing, but not for everybody, and so the newsroom tries to change for the future, which means it's leaving some readers behind, and that problem still exists. You still have print and you still have readers who only read it in print or mostly read it in print who are angry about how print has changed, and I completely understand that, but it makes it really challenging for a business that's dealing with a lot of debt and has a workforce that needs to learn how to do their job different, a workforce that is highly skilled, I will add. They're expert at what they've been doing. And now they become newbies at things like video, or
How do you call it a new
doing audio. No, we were laughing about this the other day about what our initial video efforts
Yeah.
looked like because they were just embarrassing.
It was amazingly unprofessional compared to how hard we had worked to get good stories in the paper, and then suddenly news reporters are being asked to go take video on their iPhones, add a story which is added on work.
Tony became kind of good at it.
I had some dexterity there. I was a little surprised, but not everybody did. But that was that era when you were the executive editor, where there was this in the newsroom. There were stubborn people. There were people. It was interesting to see the personalities who embraced the new. I was surprised at this guy.
Oh, you guys were.
I thought this guy's codger, but he was.
Well, you guys are. I mean, you're two of the best breaking news reporters.
Please, Tony, carry on. I want to hear the rest of this one.
I thought.
You thought you'd leave me in the dust or something.
I did think. I mean, I was seeing.
You did?
I did something else. I did look around the room and I saw people. There's certain simmering anger among some people saying, even photographers saying I don't do video. Photographers saying I don't do video. Reporters saying I don't do video. And then there was that transitional point where we were writing for newspapers and our mentality was, I want to get this top of A1 on tomorrow's newspaper. And somewhere along the way, it's like, I didn't care so much. It's like, can I get this online in time before the people go off to lunch? The news, the state workers go off to lunch, so
like
I can
10
get
a.m. or something.
I can get more, catch them when they're going to read. And boy, that transition in there for me was very easy to make because I got it. I guess I got it. And you got it too. He was.
A lot of the olds got it.
Some of the old, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I
the
don't
older
know why
reporters,
that.
a lot of them were embraced it the most, became the most competent in video, were the most productive. It was kind of interesting.
Well, there also wasn't a lot of choice in the matter.
Right.
Starting in 2009 is when the layoffs began.
Right.
Yeah.
McClatchy had sworn we'd never do layoffs. We've never had layoffs until they did.
Yeah.
And they cut 10% of the staff and then another 5%, and they did buyouts and whatever. And you had a pretty small staff, so you really didn't have the luxury anymore, if you ever did, of saying, well, I don't do video.
No.
Of course we did. And I remember when they started metering, that's the wrong word, but you could see in real time how many page views a story was getting.
Collecting the data on
Yes.
readership. Yeah.
And everybody hated that at first until you had a story that was doing well. It was like, oh, this is rather cool.
Yeah.
Remember the big screen on your way to the bathroom, the big chart
dashboard.
screen,
Yeah.
Dashboard
with
that-
all of
that's-
this.
Let's tell our audience about that. That was, part of the transition was to sell the reporters on, encourage them to do this new stuff. And so the Bee had these huge screens placed around the room. They would show which stories we had written that day, were ranked, which one ranked the highest, which one had the most readers looking at it right now, and who had the most readers for the last X amount of hours. And we would on the time we stopped there and look at, and if I'm in the top 10, I'm happy, and if not, I'm just like, I want to go back to my desk and get on that list. It was an interesting in your position to have to encourage people to make the sea change in how they. I remember the morning you held a meeting, and it was the first time somebody had said, "You come in earlier, get a story online, and we'll worry about the newspaper at the end of the day." I mean, getting a story into the news, the paper, and that wasn't a transition that happened easily. But I think. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I mean the 4:00 news meeting, which was the traditional. All the big editors gather around a table like this one and decide what goes on the next day's front page. That gave way to the 9 a.m. news meeting. Just planning out the day, what's going to be coming online, when are you going to pop something online.
Which at times became an even earlier news meetings. I mean, we changed what we were doing constantly.
Yeah.
Because we were trying to figure out what would work. And what it was no different anywhere in the country. Everybody's talking to everybody else and looking at readership numbers and revenue numbers and trying to figure out a way to succeed in a just vastly changed, customer base and readership needs and just all of that. Everybody became audience. They no longer were readers.
Right. Right.
And there were just way too many things to even remember every iteration that we went through. And what I think the kind of biggest things are, one, what were Sacramentans going through as we were doing this evolution? Because it was as hard as it was on the newsroom, and we obviously all have that kind of life experience and that focus. But from outside the Bee, you saw a dramatic lessening of customer service. You saw, as McClatchy was trying to slim down and reduce expenses fast enough to avoid bankruptcy, especially during the Great Recession, which arguably, I think the four of us all talked about this, arguably it might have been easier had we gone through bankruptcy at that time, but there were lots of reasons not to. But as it's trying to do that, it's just cutting one thing after another, and at a certain point, it's just like cutting circulation as a department, which had become audience, which does all the customer service. And you have people still wanting print who can't get print anymore. You've got people who are trying to go online, and newspaper websites were universally pretty awful for a lot of years, and I think still are at a lot of companies. Too many ads taking over, too many popping up all over, paywalls that don't work consistently and boot out subscribers, just all kinds of technology problems, because you have an industry that has still got all the costs tied to print, press room costs and the paper costs and the distribution costs and all of that needs to be able to find a way to come up with money to do technology costs. And we all know, I think, from watching Facebook and every other kind of giant technology company, that those costs are huge and developers make good money. I think the reader experience was as bumpy or more so than our experience in the newsroom. And it was, if you look at how the sausage was made to get to where it is right now, it's just pretty ugly. It was a hard time.
It was very hard times, chaotic. We were also, at the same time Tony was learning how to do video, apparently quite well.
I taught you to tweet.
That's where I was going. We also were starting to come to grips with social media.
Yeah.
And the story for me where I really started to see kind of the power of how social media was driving things was the Kings melodrama, whether or not the Kings were going to leave town, which played out over several years in the early 2010s. And it felt like, you may have heard of this outfit called Twitter. It's kind of in the news lately.
Yeah.
But it felt like Twitter was running that story. That's where you would find out stuff. And that's how you would disseminate information. You weren't just posting a link to your story. We were sort of
tweeting the news.
Live tweeting developments, because there's just no way to keep up otherwise. And it was just this crazy story, and it felt like it was governed by social media.
And that's another example of the kind of inherent conflict we were dealing with about, kind of business model. You had to tweet and break news on Twitter to be able, I think, to be considered competitive by people in the community. But nobody paid for that news.
Right.
And that was the attention span of a lot of people, the length of a tweet.
By the time you got done actually filing the story and it got posted to the web, the Twitter audience had kind of moved on to something else anyway.
Sure.
But anytime we wrote a story of consequence, we learned that we would tweet multiple tweets about that, so that Twitter was the funnel into our product.
Right, and you try to have something online to
Right.
be able to link back to get people to move in and to get some readership that way, and maybe eyeballs on ads and the kinds of things that drive revenue. But it was a constant kind of fine tuning to figure out, where's the sweet spot in what you give away and what you can make money off of to keep, the newsroom getting its payroll every week and all of that kind of thing. I mean, it's expensive to do news.